Okay.
And the interesting thing is we know what it is, what is to express chivalry. And at times when you express mercy, is you do something out of charity in the true sense of the word caritas from Latin, out of love, the Christian love. You do it to help the other person and you're not expecting anything in return. And being a knight or being a gentleman or being a lady is an extension of that. You do something out of courtesy, out of kindness, but also in a way, going back to the Christianity, is because he or she is also a son and a daughter of God.
Well, we are talking about chivalry today.
And let's talk about what is it? What is it? What do we mean by that? And what is not?
Yeah, chivalry. So that would be, well, we know that it originates or seemingly originates in the 12th century in France, well, modern day France. And it was coming from the root word, I can't say it in French, but it's like chivalry.
Right. And then
which translates to knighthood.
And it comes from the word cheval, which means a horse.
Yes.
Because the knights had the horses.
Yeah. Or chevalier.
Right.
Or something like that. Yeah. So 12th century French knighthood. And so chivalry became a daily way of life. So it was, how should a knight behave and act according to a moral code? And this is outlined in the famous poem, The Song of Roland. And in the Song of Roland, he outlines 5 principles that knights should follow, which is loyalty, courtesy, justice,
and piety,
and
tradition in literature.
Courage. How do we miss courage?
And courage.
Yeah, loyalty, courage, justice, courtesy, and piety.
All right.
So what are all these things?
And then we see that also in literature, for example, in the English literature, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. Amazing. That would be more or less the equivalent, similar period. And then they express those virtues, even from a Christian point of view, because we're talking about those knights that were Christians. They were the models, the epitome, the paradigm of the Christian knight. And in Spanish, the equivalent, it was El Cantar del Mío Cid, the song of El Cid, the poem of El Cid. And it was those expressing those models of the knights as a Christian knight. And then that's in medieval times. Even in Spanish, the equivalent for the expression of chivalry in Spanish is caballero. And it also comes from the word caballo, which means horse, and being a knight. And then in Spanish is caballero. And that's the medieval times. But we don't live in medieval times, but we can see those values today, in today's society. And the equivalent nowadays is we talk about, you have to express courtesy. We talk about courtesy and being a gentleman or being a lady. And the question I put to you is, how do we see that? How do we express those values, those concepts in your daily life or in society? What do you see? And what are the things that we shouldn't see? What is it to be a lady or to be a gentleman? And how do you express those values?
I think that's clear for anyone with a moral code. But like you were saying earlier, our society seems to take upon especially courtesy. So, handicap.
The vulnerable, the elderly, children, those who are handicapped, those who cannot help themselves.
Yeah.
You can express that mercy or care for those individuals, even as a society or even individually, right? At times, if you are in the supermarket and then there's an old lady who needs or an old gentleman who needs help with the shopping, then you give them a hand. Yep. Even the shops, right? Do you need a hand with that? And then we also have laws to protect the vulnerable, those who cannot help themselves, right?
Yeah.
And what else? What else do you see? When we say, oh, he's such a gentleman, or she's such a lady, on how to express that courtesy, being gentle, being a gentleman, is the way we think, and the way we think is then manifested in the way we act, the way we talk and the way we act. And at times it's very subtle. And it's obviously we can follow certain rules. The same at work, you have to at times follow certain codes and bylaws at work. And in our daily life, we do very much the same. We have certain things that are written, even in law. There are certain laws that when you are driving, you have to be considerate. And if there is an accident on the road, you are supposed to not leave the scene, but to help. So that's the formalized, the positive law. It has been positive. It has been determined. It has been written down by people. And then we follow other things, other conventions, the way we talk. For example, you don't start shouting at people. You don't lose your temper. If you do, we say, oh, that's not ladylike, or that's not gentlemanlike.
Right. So what does that mean?
Well, it means that to express, to be considerate towards the other person. And how do we manifest that? Well, there are practical things. You arrive on time. If you're having a meeting, you arrive on time out of consideration for the other person. Imagine you go to the aeroplane and then, well, if there are delays or starting a business meeting and everybody is late, then it's not very efficient, but it's also a lack of consideration. If you are having a conversation with somebody, you don't interrupt the other person constantly, or you don't shout at the other person. You don't start having a fight out of courtesy, out of consideration for the other person, because the other person can do it towards you. So out of practicalities is because society then functions really well in relationships, in families, and in society. Then at times when you are having dinner, well, at times it's being considerate towards the other person, and then you pass on the things, pass on the bread, instead of helping yourself first. If you are having a glass of wine, you offer the other person out of consideration. And then even at home, you can say, okay, I'm going to make myself a cup of coffee. Well, before making the cup of coffee for yourself, you can offer your wife or your family, would you like a cup of coffee, or at work? So it's always having the other person, to take the other person into account.
So if we're thinking about chivalry holistically, it, on the one hand, stipulates that men, these knights, need to treat people with consideration, with mercy, but also with prudence and courage and resolve. So where do you think the line is between treating someone with mercy and treating the vulnerable and the weak and those below you with that sort of compassion or mercy, versus the fact that these men are also knights, so they kill and they enforce laws and they administer justice as well. And it's hard to always strike a balance, because it's, should I be harsher on this person? Should I be more punishing towards this person? Or should I show them mercy in this situation? And how do we use prudence to determine, do I show this person more mercy, or do I punish this person with justice?
At times, part of the prudence is, okay, if I do it, what are the consequences? The word is to try to be, exercise prudence. And you have to have also understanding of the situation and be circumspect. What do we mean by being circumspect? Is taking into account that if I do this, what are the consequences? And what if I don't do it? If you shout at somebody, what are the consequences? You can damage the other person. Psychologically, you can, or the other person might go into depression and then might harm himself or herself. Also, we also think, okay, is it my role? Because if I'm going to tell my neighbors how to conduct themselves at home, in their houses, that's not up to me to tell, or even at work. If I'm not the manager, who am I to say? I might suggest something. And also, every situation is different. For example, at work, maybe if somebody is not doing they are doing something. Let's say somebody is drinking at work. That person might pose a risk to himself or herself and to the rest of the colleagues. If they are operating a machine under the influence, they might pose a risk to other people. So you have to then maybe speak up, even though you might not be the manager, but you might say something to help the other person. It's the same when at home, if somebody is going to touch something that you know that is dangerous, well, you alert the person, right? Because even though you might not be the father of the child, for example, who's going to touch something and they might break it and then they can hurt themselves. So those are how we in real life, how do we translate those virtues. So first is it my role, and then what do I have to do something? If you see somebody driving dangerously, you call the police. You might say, well, it's not my responsibility. Well, but if you don't do it, you might prevent, something might happen, an accident. But if you do it, you might be preventing that accident.
So then, what is the difference then between, I know you already mentioned being a gentleman and being a lady and being, gentlemanlike and ladylike. Right. The knight and the knight code would, I think, differ in that they are the law enforcement. They are the ones who execute laws and they execute justice themselves, sort of like vigilantes.
Yeah. To some extent, yes.
Whereas a gentleman, like a knight, might kill someone who poses a threat, and they might make the prudent decision to kill someone.
Or not. Because
a gentleman, even in a situation where there is a threat, might not necessarily kill him. He might go to call the police, right. Or he might have a different resolve. Can you kind of speak on the difference there between the idea of being a knight versus a gentleman?
Well, nowadays, because we're in the 21st century, we don't have those. The concept is, to some extent, as you would say in Latin, mutatis mutandis. Even though we are living in different countries, different periods of history, the principles are very much the same. Exercising, the courage to be a gentleman, because nowadays, and to do the right thing, to be polite, even, for example, the courage not to lose it, not to lose your temper. It requires self-control, but also the courage, if there is an injustice, let's say at work, or somebody is trying to, or even at home, you might have the courage to say, that is unfair. Or if somebody is mistreating an elderly person, you might have the courage to say, don't do it, right? So it's part of that code. The loyalty, that was, again, in the medieval literature, it was one of the concepts of loyalty. It goes back also to Roman times. If you look at the moral code of the ideal Roman, it was the ideal citizen. It was very much the same.
That's right.
And the loyalty, how do we exercise and practice that loyalty? Well, it's obvious. You are loyal to your family, your friends, in the church, the people you owe that loyalty. And how do you express that? Well, at times being for that person, when they might call you, they might send you a text message or a phone call and say, I need to talk to you. Or at times it's how you behave with that person to express that loyalty. You don't have to physically be there. And at times it's the things that you talk about with that person and the things you don't talk about with that person.
Yeah. I mean, this virtue of loyalty, I think, is interesting because it's not, it doesn't really apply to being loyal to those at your level or below you. Usually when you're talking about loyalty, it's the fact that you are serving someone above you, someone who has authority over you. And it's being loyal to that person despite the fact that you might not agree with everything they do. You might not agree with their leadership, but you're loyal to them because they possess that power. And it comes, I think it comes down to the belief that all the power we're given in our life ultimately comes from God. If we are in a position of authority or a position of power, then we only receive that power through God because God has allowed this to be so. And I think that speaks to the notion of loyalty because God will test us by making us subordinate to leaders that are imperfect and are fallen and have flaws. And just as he expects your leader to be good and to be just, he also expects you to be loyal and support your authority, even if they mess up and they're not perfect or they do something wrong and maybe they don't make the prudent decision. I just think that dynamic is interesting because you have loyalty on the one hand and then you have courtesy or mercy on the other hand, and that deals with people below you. So it's very hierarchical.
Do you think that loyalty is related or connected in some way to power or authority?
I think it for sure authority because it has to do with, I think, this medieval notion of a hierarchical society where there are, based on your social status, there are those who are above you because they're aristocrats and they have temporal authority given to them either by the state or the fact that they are lords or they are, feudal kings or what have you. So there definitely is this element of a hierarchy. And I think that loyalty has to do with serving those above you, and courtesy and mercy has to do with serving those below you. And it's about, I guess, maintaining this cohesive unit.
Like courtesy, also expressing courtesy. You can express courtesy. You don't have to express loyalty to. You can manifest courtesy, and you don't have to be loyal to somebody because it could be just one-off. You go to a shop or you talk to somebody. You go outside to the street and then you talk to somebody. You say hello to somebody, being out of politeness. You don't have to be loyal to that person. Loyalty, you express loyalty to your spouse, to your parents, but also you express loyalty the same to the people who work for you and the people you work for, other people. So the person who works for you, they might express some loyalty. I feel loyal to that person. And at times it's nothing to do with the salary per se. There are so many people who volunteer their time and energy and resources, and they're helping other people out of charity, and they are loyal to the organization. They are also loyal to the church, or they are loyal to the family, and they are loyal. And the same as they are loyal to an employer, for example, the employer also expresses loyalty to some of the employees. So if you employ a cleaning lady or somebody who's looking after your property, at times you feel committed to that person. You feel loyal, and you want to treat that person fairly, but also in a polite way. You are not going to shout to that person. You are going to be considerate towards that person. And on many, many occasions, people say, I'm going to employ that person because he needs me or she needs me. And you express loyalty towards also the employees, those people talking about the hierarchy. You mentioned the hierarchy, and then it's a way of expressing loyalty. So it's reciprocal.
Yes.
The same with a relationship, your friends. You feel loyal to your friend, and your friend feels loyalty towards you.
Yeah, I think, and I don't disagree. It's just I think that loyalty, the true meaning of the word refers to when someone, a subordinate is in particular, is rightly serving the people that have authority over them. Whereas I think, and loyalty can go both ways, but I think it's in particular targeting those who are below, serving those who are above. Whereas mercy, it's hard to be merciful to someone who has authority over you, right? Like that's not how that dynamic works. It can certainly happen. But it's not the true meaning of the word in that sense. Like the Lord Jesus Christ has mercy on us, and we ask for his mercy. Why do we ask for his mercy and not his loyalty? Well, because he's above us. He is the pinnacle of the hierarchy, the social hierarchy, because he's king of the nations. He's king of everyone. And so that his mercy rains down on us because he's from above. It would be weird for us to say we have mercy on Jesus Christ, except for maybe, the Roman soldiers and the Jews during the time of his crucifixion. So I think that's an important dynamic to point out, because the idea of loyalty and mercy kind of play these two roles in upholding the social hierarchy. Whereas now, as you sort of alluded to, we have a lot more people who are on the same plane as us. So we have colleagues and we have people that are considered equals because we live in an egalitarian society. We don't have a hierarchical society where people know precisely what their roles and their status is in relation to one another. It's more obscure, I think.
I would argue that there is a hierarchy in our society.
Oh, there is, yeah. It's obscured more though than before, I think.
Yeah, in terms of those classes, the groups that in medieval times, the nobility, the aristocracy, the nobility, the clergy, they were more defined. But nowadays we see that effectively. The different groups, at times we are being told that we are all equal, but the reality is that there are a lot of differences. And it's related to, you're talking about the mercy. For example, if you're an employee, you might not be merciful towards your manager because, again, the authority. But then at the same time, you might be expressing that mercy or charity or kindness towards somebody else.
That's
when
right.
you go to the shop, or towards somebody in your family or your neighbor. So because we are individuals and we are complex and we have different roles, you might not have the authority to do something in this environment, but in another environment, you do have the authority.
That's a very good point, actually, because it calls back to a parable that Jesus told about a master who had mercy on his servant and forgave him his debts. And then that servant, I'm trying to remember how it goes, but that servant went and was harsh against the person below him.
Right.
And then the master found out about this and he was not happy with the servant because he's basically saying to him, well, I was merciful towards you. Why are you not merciful towards your subordinate? Right. And I like that parable because it goes to show that we all have a duty, regardless of where we are in life, to always have mercy on those below us insofar as we can, and it's just. And
kindness. It's not only just mercy. Yeah. At times it's out of justice, and at times it's nothing to do with justice. For example, if you employ somebody, an electrician, out of justice you have to compensate, you have to pay for. Or you take a taxi, out of justice you have to pay for that taxi. And at times when you express mercy, you do something out of charity. Charity in the true sense of the word caritas from Latin, out of love, Christian love. That you do it to help the other person, and you're not expecting anything in return. And being a knight or being a gentleman or being a lady is an extension of that. You do something out of courtesy, out of kindness, but also in a way, going back to the Christianity, is because he or she is also a son and a daughter of God. is God's creature, and the same as, because they are God's creatures, you have to treat that creature with respect, and vice versa. It reminds me of the French term noblesse oblige. Nobility is an obligation. It forces you to behave. If you have resources, if you have the authority over somebody, or you have the power to help somebody, if there is this moral contract, it's not written, you have to exercise that kindness towards the other person. And especially if you have resources. But at times people say, well, I'm not rich. I'm not part of the nobility. I'm not wealthy. I'm not a rich man or a rich woman. But then you might say, yeah, but you have time. You can help other people. You can volunteer, or even at times being at home, that relationship with your siblings or towards the neighbors, out of courtesy, out of politeness, you do it. There is this moral contract, again, not written, and that's why the expression noblesse oblige. But some people say, oh, if you have the resources, you are supposed to behave in a kind way towards everybody else. And actually, at times, not everybody deserves that. And then part of your prudence.
But do we do it because they deserve it or not?
Right. For example, at times people say, "Oh, I'm going to open the door for the person who comes," and they might say, "Well, I don't need that." Or when you maybe say, "Please take a seat," it's like, "Well, are you calling me?" And then they might be rude to you. But then, as a gentleman or as a lady, you don't take the bite. You just smile and then also you have to exercise prudence, and you decide whether that person, maybe there's something wrong with the person, or maybe he's having a bad day or has some issues, because it happens. But you do it because of who you are, not because the other person might deserve it. Because if the other person is rude towards you and vulgar towards you and unfair towards you at work, at times people experience that. You still do it. Obviously, you are not a masochist. You are not going to help the person time and time again, knowing that the other person is going to misbehave towards you. And so you have to exercise, to be diligent and to be prudent. But then a lot of people, when we talk about noblesse oblige, okay, it's not only how you moral obligation to help other people, but the other people have the moral obligation also to reciprocate. So when we say noblesse oblige, yes, you can help the other person, and you are going to treat the other person with kindness. It should be reciprocal, and the other person should also treat you with courtesy, consideration, and also to show dignity, which is part of those codes, the moral code of to treat somebody with dignity, and the other person also to treat you with dignity.
So then, what do we do if we treat others respectfully and with kindness, but we don't receive that in return?
Well, then you just, as a gentleman, or as a knight, you just take it on the chin. You just smile or maybe withdraw. You don't expect it, and then also the next time you might have to exercise some prudence. And if the other person is going to misbehave towards you, well, exercise prudence. But you don't take the bite. You are not going to start a fight. You're not going to insult the other person. If somebody insults you, well, it's only an insult, right? If somebody, if you're lining up and somebody jumps in front of you, well, you might say something. But if the other person is going to be rude to you and vulgar, well, then it also depends on the circumstance. You might have to say something politely. There is some people did a PhD a long time ago about the theory of politeness, and this is very interesting. And the premise is that the way we talk to people has an effect on people. At times it's a good effect, at times it's bad effect. And I'll give you an example. If you go to the shop and then somebody says to you, "What are you looking at?" It's very confrontational. If the same person says to you, "Oh, may I help you? You seem to be lost." Or, "Are you looking for something?" Effectively, the person is telling you the same, but how he's talking to you, it will have a positive effect or negative effect. So as a gentleman, well, I was just a normal person, a civilized person, and well brought up person, you are supposed to exercise with the language, with the behavior, that consideration, at times for your own benefit, because if you are going to say to somebody being rude or being vulgar or an insult, it can create, it can trigger the other person and it can exercise violence. We see that all the time. You open the newspapers and there's rage. And you always ask, what happened? Somebody said something and then the whole thing, and at times people kill each other because of that. So,
yeah. So if we're talking about how to apply this idea of chivalry in today's society, now I'm thinking with movements like the LGBT or BLM, where they are intrinsically evil and disordered because their entire movement is premised on a lie and either a lie or just a complete abomination. In dealing with people like that, obviously in mercy, we want to convert them. We want them to see the error in their ways and to realize that being a part of those movements doesn't serve them, and it's not going to help them. It's not going to bring them closer to God. It's not going to help them grow in virtue. It's actually going to do the opposite. And it's going to lead them to all sorts of vices like looting and stealing and burning and all the rest that we've seen over the past few years. There's a part of us that wants to administer mercy on these people so that they can step away from that. But then there's also a part of us that wants to give justice and to see justice, because the things they do is abominable and it's evil and it's twisted. So how exactly do we reconcile between these two things that we want to achieve with regards to dealing with these sorts of movements, these social movements?
We only have power over yourself, how you behave, and maybe some people you might have some influence on them. What I would say is by example, because you cannot force. Nobody can force you to change. Even nobody can come to you, Adam, I want you to change. Okay, you might say, well, I might consider your advice. But they cannot force you unless they cannot force you. The same, in your case, you cannot force somebody else to change. And also at times you have to be, again, what we were saying earlier, is it part of do we have the authority? If your neighbor comes over and say, well, I want you to lead your life, your private life in this way, because this is what I believe. And you are going to say, and who are you? Well, I'm your neighbor. Or you might say, well, but you don't have the authority over me. I mean, I can consider listening to your advice or your opinion, which is fine, out of consideration. Thank you very much for your opinion. But that's the limit. And the same with you. You cannot go around and saying to somebody, I want you to change.
Right.
They might say, well, you can say it. Good luck.
Yeah.
But what they might consider is, in many, many situations, is how you behave. If you are being kind and being considerate, people will notice that. If you are being aggressive and being rude and being inconsiderate, they also notice that. So people will, and the same, we are all the result of our families, society, our upbringing, the people we talked to when we were children, teenagers, as adults. We are very much influenced. Our ideas are not our ideas. They are we have received those ideas and the values. The fact that we're having this conversation is also the result of a whole culture, a whole civilization. How we started talking about the literature. So it's basically 1,000 years of that tradition, even going back to the Roman times and the Greek times. So we are the result of that, and we try to do better. We try to emulate those role models. So answering your question, I would say just if you want people to do better, be an example, which is always a challenge every single day, every single action that the minute we are opening our eyes, okay, how you present yourself, how you talk to somebody, you greet somebody. And then they might say, I can look at Adam and he epitomizes the values that he's talking about. And then they might consider, because we are the result of many, many people who have had an influence on us. And we look up to them. We say, I want to follow that example. They were not perfect, but we usually, the way we behave is, okay, I liked this particular, he was very attentive. Or he was, the way he treated me, he was always with consideration. He was always listening to me. He was giving me advice. He was attentive or polite. And that's, in my experience, that's how you change your society, the people you deal with, you relate to. You cannot change the whole society because it's impossible, but you do have an effect.
Yeah, but then I guess what I was meaning to ask is, I mean, you did a good job of talking about the different dynamics associated with, what does mercy look like towards these wicked people. But we also do have a duty to administer justice insofar as we have the ability and it's prudent to do so. So kind of what I'm asking is, during what
do you mean by administering justice? First of all, is it your role? Do you have the authority to administer? And what do you mean by administering justice?
Like during the BLM riots, particularly in 2020, 2021, there were people who were getting their businesses crashed in.
Which we didn't have here.
No, we didn't have them here. But in the US, they were going rampantly. And there was people who had their businesses destroyed. And some people boarded up their windows and they weren't there. But other people were fighting back.
Right.
And they were actively defending their property and their livelihoods amidst this chaos and violence. And that's where I'm kind of wondering, what is the prudential decision here? Do you let the mob steamroll through businesses and through cities? Or, if we were living in the US, or do you pick up your guns and you go out there and you defend your property and defend your livelihood? Because there were some people who went out and defended themselves, and there were others who just boarded up their windows and walked away.
You're talking about an extreme, because
but we saw it. It is an extreme, but we lived through it. And we saw people who did both. There were some people who picked up their guns and they defended the statue. They defended their business. In New York, there was, I believe, a Korean guy who went out with a sword and was going against the mob with a katana.
And the police were not acting.
The police were not there. So in absence of the actual justice that was supposed to be there, what do we do?
Well,
because we can't always count on.
More chances are that we're not going to see something like that here, because of, again, the different culture, different society. And I always ask why those things, or certain violence, for example, that's an extreme, happens in some families, in some societies, and not in others. So rather than, because what we see is the result of a behavior and attitude that has been there for a long time. And I always ask myself, okay, why is it you can have a conversation and discussion with this individual and you get along, and in other communities or in other families or in other groups, they're always fighting? And you have to ask yourself that. And partly of being a gentleman and talking about courtesy and using mercy and charity is to create an environment that we do not see that violence.
Do we owe those people mercy and charity? Do we owe it to them? What I'm trying to figure out is the people who stood up and fought in this example, were they wrong in doing so? Was that not being charitable? Or was it them justly defending their property?
You have the right to defend. If you have a shop and somebody is going to steal or is going to attack you physically with a sword or gun, of course you have the right to defend yourself, and you have the right to defend your property. That's why there's a door, and you might have a security camera.
But is it chivalrous? Because I would argue that it is.
What's chivalry?
Because I would say that the people who stood up and defended their property and defended their livelihood and their businesses from the riot, the mob, were actually the knightly, chivalrous crowd, as opposed to the people who boarded up their windows and walked away. Because in my view, the people who boarded up their windows and walked away are the kind of people that are not willing to take a stand when things are bleak and when things are hard. And I'm not going to say that they're wrong. I'm just saying that that's not the chivalrous thing to do. Like, they probably had reasons, and not everyone can defend their property. But the fact of the matter is, I think it's more chivalrous of the people who did, because if everyone boarded up their windows and walked away, the mob would have zero resistance because the police weren't there, and then there's no consequences to their actions. And all you do is you actually embolden them to keep pillaging and keep destroying things. Whereas when people take a hardline stop in the name of justice and say, no, you burning buildings and lighting stuff up and actually yelling racist slogans is not right, and we have a right to.
So they were acting.
Put a stop to that.
The mob was acting with exercising the privilege, because they knew that there were not going to be consequences. Yeah. They knew that the police were not going to act, and they didn't. And we saw that in Winnipeg a couple of years ago, when the mob took down some statues, which it goes against the criminal code, and the police were there, and they didn't want to enforce it. They didn't. Nobody got arrested, and they were there. And in that case, well, then justice falls apart, obviously, and it was they were neglecting their duty as police, because those people, the mob who did it, knew they were acting with privilege. They knew that nothing was going to happen, and they did it. But my point is that in some societies, the whole point of trying to bring up people with those virtues, actually to try to show them the virtues, morality, to act with kindness, respect, with dignity towards yourself and towards the other people, will prevent, and does prevent, those violent acts. And that's why the vast majority of people do not commit violence. The vast majority. I mean, you go out and you don't see riots. Obviously, there will always be a percentage of individuals who are, for different reasons, at times mental issues or addictions or personality, or at times just pure evil. They are going to be violent and attacked, and but that's fortunately is the minority, despite of what the media want to portray. But the question is, why the vast majority don't act like that? Because they have been well brought up, and there is a moral code that they follow, and they say, no, I'm not going to exercise violence. I'm going to be respectful towards myself and towards my family and towards my neighbors. And when I go to the shops or when I go to work, I'm going to be attentive and I'm going to be respectful. And that's why societies and civilizations work. And obviously, there will always be people who are not like that. And that's why we have the police, and there's a justice system, and some people end up in court to try to administer that justice, to try to balance things. But I think the solution is to try to do better and be better, and use at times those courtesies. If you are polite towards somebody and you say, thank you very much, that thank you very much, or can I help you with this? You have changed. There are many, well, we all have anecdotes. It can change your day, and it can change the person's day, and it can change his life. And the same in your case. Somebody is kind towards you, and maybe you are going through a crisis today, and then somebody exercises some kindness towards you, and it might change. And people usually say, "Oh, you restored my faith in humanity, in humankind."
I think those people are foolish. Don't have faith in humanity. Humanity is a letdown. Have faith in God. My last question has to do with the fifth virtue that is mentioned in the Song of Roland. And that is, so we talked a little bit about loyalty and courtesy and courage, and a little bit about justice as well. How about piety? What does piety look like in our day and age, especially concerning obeying and doing our duties as Catholics? Well, and what does that look like today, where there's this crisis in the church, there's things going on that are very confusing for people? What does piety look like, and how do we live out that moral duty?
And that piety is to do with doing your duty, as you pointed out. And we all have a duty. You wake up, and then you have things to do in your life towards your family and your colleagues at work. Even as a citizen, you have some duties to do that. And then the exercise in the piety is not only just the relationship towards and the loyalty towards God, but also how do you translate that into loyalty is related to God's creatures, because in a way you are saying, okay, I'm also a creature of God, and the same with my fellow members of society, and you have to exercise that duty. And partly it's the manifestation of what we have been saying, is how do you exercise that duty and commitment, the way you talk to them, the way you behave towards them. Because when we say, I love God, or I love my neighbor, I love thy neighbor, okay, how do you manifest that? When you say, oh, I love hockey, it's because you spend time, money, energy, you watch videos, you watch the games. And the same when we say, when I love God, how do I manifest that? Not only just the prayers, but in how do I manifest that relationship towards God's creatures? And how do I show that appreciation, respect, dignity? And it's the way we talk. That's why at times at work, even in the parliament, they talk about decorum. Well, you are showing a lack of decorum, or you are showing decorum. Is how you behave.
Decorum?
Decorum.
Yeah.
How do you exercise that value, that virtue? How do you behave properly as a gentleman? When we say, well, that's unbecoming. If you are a doctor, and if you, or just yourself, if you start insulting somebody or using vulgar language, well, that shows a lack of decorum. And unbecoming, because it's not proper of you. You are being now a bad example, and it's part of what we do every single day, how to be better, how you present yourself, how you talk to people, being respectful, being kind, the way you talk, just listening to people, saying good morning, saying thank you, please, the basic things. And then when you are helping people, can I help you? May I do this for you? So it's pretty basic. We don't need a PhD to do that.
No.
And it's not complicated. And even with these novels, the La Chanson de Roland or Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, the idea was they were the archetypes of those being a knight and doing the duty in society. And again, mutatis mutandis. Today we have duties. We don't have those horses, but you say, what is your duty and your commitment trying to help society? Ultimately, which is basically, those are part of the Christian code, is ultimately to help the fellow man and the soul, right? To try to save souls, but at the same time in our society, you have to help individuals, right?
Yeah, just with survival and the things that go along with
But
living.
if you want to change society, change yourself first. Be kind to towards yourself and towards the other people, and then you don't see as many fights as in other societies. And I'll give you an example. At times, There was somebody who did the study years and years ago, and then they wanted to change the street. So he changed the facade. There was graffiti, and then they changed his house, the facade. He started to look after the garden, and within a short period of time, the next neighbor did the same, improve, beautify the facade, and then the next neighbor and the next neighbor, and within a short period of time, the whole street was free of graffiti and garbage. And I saw that myself when I lived in England. I did it in my little street, and within a year, there was no garbage on the street, there was no graffiti. The neighbors started planting flowers, we started talking to each other, and within a year, we transformed the street. So the same with the good behavior and being polite and being exercising courtesy.
Mm. Yeah, so I would pretty much echo the sentiment that piety is pretty basic. It's simple, but it's not always easy to do. You know, we're called to pray every day. We're called to pray our rosaries. We're called to learn Catholic teachings and learn our faith, especially in during these times. And that's a hard thing to do because it can be a bitter pill to swallow for some. They realize in learning their faith and learning about the truth that there are ways that they have to change in their life to live in accordance with that. They have to realize that through prayer, God is going to demand more of us. He's going to test us, and we have to hold true to that faith and clasp onto God to get through the trials and the tribulations of life, because otherwise we won't merit the kingdom of heaven. And we have to work through that to not only love thy neighbor, but most importantly, to love God with thy whole mind, with thy whole heart, and with thy soul. I think a lot of people do a pretty good job generally of loving thy neighbor, but of course there's those who they think they love thy neighbor, but they're completely misguided by immorality and wickedness. But we can't properly love thy neighbor if we don't love God first. And I think it's so important that love thy God is the first and greatest commandment, because if you don't love God, then, and you don't know God and you don't understand God and you're not part of his one true Catholic Church, then your goodwill towards neighbors is completely in vain, because you're operating off of a false framework, and you might actually be doing harm to their souls, even though you might be materially making them better off. Because there's always this, you know, a lot of us are complacent that, if we just had more money, if we just had more resources, then things would be better. Well, no, things are not going to be better unless people have good moral teachings in order that they can use those resources in a truly moral, beneficent way.
And that's the theory. In theory, that's how it works. In practice, is how do we translate that? How do we manifest that? You can say, well, you have to love God. Very good. But then, or pray. But then there is no use if then we are treating somebody with disrespect, being rude to them, or being upset with them, or not being considerate. So we have to be consistent. And I would say though that to love God is also to love thy neighbor, because by loving God, we are obliged to love our neighbor. If we say we love God, but we don't love our neighbor, then we don't really love God. And at times we can be the source of the neighbor's tribulations. So it's important to take that into account, to try to conduct your life in a gentle, to be a gentleman and to be a lady.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you very much for the conversation. Great conversation.
Yes. Okay. That's it.